publicly held meeting, and it will be made available to all, including you all, as soon as we get it processed. So I've been trying to get them uploaded as basically as quickly as we can, so people can review the material in video form, if that would be helpful for you, if you want to recall something that was said by another RAC member participant. But here we are on the second meeting of the Amendment Rulemaking Advisory Committee. Today is September 26th, and I am Thomas Jackman, the Rules Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Energy. So we are here today to discuss kind of this the material that I was sent out about a week ago, but essentially the bulk of today's meeting is going to be a discussion of sort of staff suggestions for select amendment rulemaking concerns. It says staff suggestions because not a whole lot was sent to myself after our last RAC meeting, which I just assume when that happens that everybody just loves the direction that things are going, and you're just waiting to see where we go with it. And so that's exactly what we're going to do here. I have sort of on the schedule put an open discussion by RAC after the review of the staff suggestions, but and we certainly can do that, but we can also just discuss each issue as it pops up on in the review itself. So we don't have to wait until the end. If people have thoughts or feelings about each idea, go ahead and raise your hand. The group is small enough today that you can probably just leave your mic off mute and just go for it. But you can also raise your hand too. And then there will be an opportunity for public comment. I'm guessing it's not going to take 2.5 hours and 45 minutes. I initially scheduled this for 3 hours because there's a lot of substantive material here that we could potentially fill our time. But if everybody's sort of on the same page, then we will, with respect to some of these issues, we're going to zoom right through them. So there will be a public comment opportunity time. I don't know exactly when that will be, though. And then we'll finish with the discussion of next steps. So as a reminder, the rulemaking process, we're still here in this second box here, developing the draft proposed rules. This is what we call the informal rulemaking phase. And once we're done with this, it begins the public comment period. But we're still deep in the development phase here. So this schedule I set as a sort of aggressive timeline, and I showed this slide at the last meeting. Given there wasn't very much feedback after that meeting, I do actually think this is sort of becoming more realistic in terms of what we can expect. I mean, there was a world in which people had a lot of differing and strong opinions. This process could literally take more than a year. A lot of RACs do, but at this point, we'll see how things go. Certainly could get interesting, but I anticipate after this RAC, we have one, certainly easily two more RACs where we go over staff's kind of draft proposed language, which would then culminate in presentation of that draft language to the council and launch of the notice to propose rulemaking period. Any questions anybody have? You guys are all on mute, except Irene. Feel free to just pipe in here. Okay, as a reminder, the scope of this rulemaking today is fairly broad. We literally went at the top of Amendment 27, and as staff, and just went down to the until we hit the bottom, and just looked at each rule and said, is this rule working? Could it be better? Do we even need it at all? Is it serving its intended function? And sort of in an attempt to kind of meet these three goals of improving the clarity, which is always an issue, just improving the process as a whole based on kind of issues that have come up in recent years, to identify problems with the rules, and then also to the extent there's been any sort of new rules, new statutes, a new direction from the courts to ensure that this update would address that. That's the scope. So outside the scope would just be anything not related to the amendment process. So that's going to primarily be Division 27, but we might need to tweak other little rules that are directly connected to the amendment process that are located somewhere else. But the scope isn't really locked in until we do the notice of proposed rulemaking. Okay, so here we are. I didn't have a really, this is the first issue. And in the packet that was sent last week to the RAC. But this issue is, there was some concern raised by some citing staff members that maybe the 3 could conditions in OER Rule 350 in Division 27 aren't necessarily, as effective as they could be in determining whether something was an amendment or not. And if you're not familiar with what those are, I've listed them here, but essentially the 3 coulds are: could the proposed change result in a significant adverse impact that the council has not addressed in an earlier order? Could the proposal impair the certificate holder's ability to comply with the site certificate condition? Could the change require a new condition or a change to a condition in the site certificate? And if any of these are triggered, then it requires an amendment. So after some deep thought, some sort of review of the previous applications for an amendment, we concluded that we could clarify the rule, tweak them a little bit, but essentially we don't need to do a whole lot here. So this jurisdictional threshold issue is just to clarify, because it's not really clear right now, that if somebody is proposing an amendment where the proposal is the size of what would qualify jurisdictionally as its own energy facility, that is allowable as an amendment. And then also to update this rule for the Supreme Court, which is had a ruling that basically said any proposed change that would include a change in the site boundary must be an amendment. So it can't bypass the sort of citing process. It triggers the amendment process automatically. So we would need to update the rules to reflect that Supreme Court ruling. Any thoughts or concerns with staff's thinking on this particular item? If you can save it until we're done, we go through all these, or you can raise it here. Either way, hearing nothing, I'm going to move to the next one. Okay, so sort of similar, on the same vein as the last issue. So there's just questions like, we created in the previous major rulemaking on the amendment process 5 years ago, a type track system to try to, the amendment process already is trying to be more efficient. The recognition that the site has already sort of been vetted, and we should have a more streamlined approach to changes to that site. There's no need to start from zero. But there's even smaller changes. There's bigger changes and smaller changes. So we have a type A and a type B to reflect that. Type B being the smaller amendments, and then type A being larger amendments. But in order to get onto type B track to save some time, you have to have an amendment determination request, which takes time. And so the question was raised, does it take more time to make the determination than you save by being on the type B track at all? Would it make more sense to just get rid of this, not do a determination at all, and then just have one track that we try to make as efficient as possible? And as a spoiler, we can't really answer this question until we sort of address some other issues in this as part of this rulemaking. But depending on how we address those other issues, we concluded that no, we're getting better at this. And as you can see, there is a gap here. The average duration of a type B amendment is 4 months shorter. So it's definitely quicker, although maybe it's quicker just because the types of things that apply to be a type B are already going to be shorter. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, just a clarifying question here. Is type B, is that really just a request if an amendment is required?
If an amendment is required, if an amendment is required, you could also be type A. I guess I'm not totally understanding your question.
Yeah, well, Sarah probably can help me out, because requested a determination from from staff if an amendment is required for a certain action at a certificated facility. And that's what I'm asking. Is that what type B is, or am I misunderstanding that?
Terry, go ahead and answer that.
Sure. Yeah.
Yep.
So this is Sarah Esterson. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor in the Citing Division. An amendment determination request, which is what I think you're referring to, Andy, where a
Yes.
developer can seek a written determination from the department on whether we agree an amendment is or isn't required. That's a different process and set of rules than type B. Type B is, we have already confirmed, or developers already confirmed, an amendment is required, but under type B, there's less procedural steps, most specifically a public hearing and opportunity for contested case.
Then I don't have a question.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So your thing was related to this previous thing. Did your amendment trigger one of these three codes? If it does, then it must be an amendment, which brings you to the second part of that. Okay, it's got to be an amendment, but could it be a type B amendment, which is quicker, or is it a more complicated amendment so that it merits being a type A amendment? So
yeah,
it's sort of a two-part process.
The amendment determination is very handy for us to determine if we need an amendment, so that we're confirming that we're in compliance with our site certificate, and then have a path forward for getting work done.
Yeah. Yeah, we're definitely, the ADR or amendment determination request processes would stick around regardless. It would just be, do we keep this second part where we try to get you on a faster track if we determine it's a more straightforward amendment. Regardless of whether we keep this sort of two-track system, we don't use the C at all, but probably wouldn't touch it unless we're just getting rid of all three. Staff is going to, depending on what we do elsewhere, we think it is worth it to make the determination. We are saving some time overall, but part of that time gap of 4 months is the review time by staff. So this would be a new duty that we'd be imposing on ourselves to shorten the review time for completeness by staff from currently 60 days on the type A track to 30 days. So that would theoretically shrink that 4-month average to 3 months. So it would be less advantageous to go to a B track because the B track wouldn't change at all. So we would be tightening up the A track to try to speed things along if we keep the track system at all. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm guessing none of you have a problem with staff making things harder for themselves. Okay. All right. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question here, sort of a comment. The thing with the type A, B, and C, I think there's an issue with, my guess is, and I'll give you an example, that staff would decide that it was a type C if there's already something was going to happen within an existing boundary. And it seems like there's a conflict there between the coulds when a developer has a site and they're going to, and this is specifically, the example is B2H, where they want to extend the boundary to a really large area and then have the opportunity to ask for a type C amendment without having basically to avoid doing the amendment process. But yet I'm trying to figure out how it is that we have the coulds. Could it impact, could there be a required site certificate condition, and that, so that wouldn't really fit under not requiring an amendment. If they're adding something within the site boundary that isn't already there, how can they avoid doing so that's my concern, is that staff is going to approve those kinds of changes without doing an amendment, even though clearly those kinds of things are going to fall within the three coulds. So
So just a couple of things in response. The department hasn't run the type C process in its current state since the 2017 amendment rulemaking. So we don't have a lot of experience with it, but at least from my perspective, the criteria for justifying type C are pretty difficult to meet. You know, it's like an emergency situation that they couldn't reasonably have contemplated. And it also is almost like a doubling of process in that they could get a temporary order from staff, but then they run the risk of council not agreeing because they still have to go through the full process. So it's a weird, I mean, I don't love it, but so putting
Nobody's
that
ever done
aside,
it.
right? And
Yeah.
we've kind of asked what kind of circumstances would justify type C, and I haven't been presented with one. So then just kind of Boardman to Hemingway specific, I personally am not aware of Idaho Power making the position that if they were to run into a situation where they worked out of the approved micrositing areas or outside the site boundary, that their intent is to try to request type C and go through that process. I am not aware that that was their position, but like what Andy was talking about, when for any type of facility modification or impact, we have 3 processes where a developer can seek concurrence from the department on whether those changes would necessitate an amendment. And of course, you're evaluating the 3 coulds. But so for anything that happens with Boardman to Hemingway, we would have to apply those 3 coulds if they're not certain or don't think an amendment is needed. And then doubly difficult and additive in process would be a request for type C. I mean, that, again, we haven't run it, but I think it is very heavy on doubling of process steps just to get a temporary order from staff that's not that can be overturned by the department or the council. So I'm hopeful that that is not Idaho Power's plan, because that's going to clog us up for sure.
I understand that is their plan, but and I'm wondering why we even have a Part C. I mean, you're saying that it's complicated, confusing,
right?
And I mean, either people need an amendment or they don't, based on the 3 coulds. So why are we having a
offer that
type C at all?
It's a good question for the RAC. I mean, I don't know if you've all reviewed it's Rule 380, but it's the Type C review process for pre-operational requests for amendment. It's essentially when you want to propose a change to a portion of the facility that's not yet in operation, but no one's ever done it. Andy, do you have a thought? Go for it.
I have a question, and Sarah, specifically to you. I thought our Amendment 12 for the site for MIST was a Type C, but I've got it pulled up, but it was done in 2017, so it may have happened before the rule changes.
It was the equivalent of Type C before we had Type C, but I think in new amendment rules, it's a slightly different process. But that's an example under the old rule structure where we ran that process.
Yeah, and Irene, the reason why it happened on the storage field is we had a water source already in the site certificate that we had to change, and we changed it through a Type C, but it was done before the current rules are in place. So It was during construction and that sort of thing. So
right. I mean, what it provides, if it can be justified and the department hasn't made any errors, is an ability to move forward with a change in a shorter time frame than what we're seeing here in Type A or B, a minimum of 6 months, which is pretty difficult if you're in the middle of construction and you want to stay in compliance.
Yeah.
And the challenge that I see is if you were to approve a Type C and the developer is going to immediately start taking action, and if the impacts are significant, by the time there's any public involvement in that, the damage is already going to be done because of the time frames between doing a Type C and the time when actually the amendment process happens.
in a situation where everyone has done it wrong.
Right.
Right. If they do it right, there shouldn't be damage, but.
One recommendation I'll make for, or consideration for a type C being still in play is for non-generating facilities, one of the conditions for going through an amendment process is an increase in horsepower for gas, turbines or compressors, that sort of thing. In the event that a gas utility such as ours were to have a catastrophic failure of, say, one of our compressors at the storage field, and it's not going to require any impacts or expansion of of the site boundary, but I need to replace a turbine and compressor, and I can't get a like for like replacement, and which means I'm going to have to change horsepower, which is going to trigger an amendment process. I would like to have C available to me so that I can quickly get it replaced and uh, maintain my deliverability out of my mist storage field or any other compressor that I happen to have with a site certificate without impacting customers and life of safety of the public.
Mhm.
Maybe part of the answer would be to say the type C could be available once a development is after construction, during operation, because that's really what you're talking about, is something that occurs that becomes an emergency. It's hard to say that you're going to have an emergency of that sort until after the facility is actually constructed. So might I suggest that?
David?
Yeah. The thing with construction is, like operations, if there is a needed change, and again, it's hard to foresee
Mhm.
every circumstance. I think having C available with its limited, defined approach is not necessarily bad. I can't give you a perfect example of how it might be, but as even during construction, if you're moving along and I don't know, a certain widget, or I'm being hypothetical because I don't have a really defined example because it hasn't happened yet, but
Mhm.
a certain widget that might be, have a blade length, if it's wind, of slightly different, and now you're not in compliance with the height to ground, but it's not, it's not an important, like, it's not a health and safety related issue, it's still within parameters. To have to go through an amendment process for something like that versus in a C would be, would just simply cost tremendous amounts of money without actually having an impact or an issue with health, safety, or environmental impact.
Mhm.
That's my only, and again, I would have to think through it, but that having it there is, and it's limited, I don't think is necessarily that bad. You might want to put a few of those others, but it's fairly tightly defined. Like you can't just.
It's not
You know,
everything.
I would feel far more comfortable if C were to say that it is available. It is only available in the event that there isn't a health, safety, or environmental impact, because of the fact that it happens immediately without a really thorough public review of the process.
Mhm.
And what you're talking about are things where they're not really significant changes. I don't think that they're things that the public would have a desire to have a real active involvement in.
I
Okay.
don't know, Irene, anytime we put natural gas infrastructure in, there's a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So for this one, I guess I would. I didn't mean we didn't even have Type C being as an issue. So you've kind of heard some thoughts here. and we can talk about it some more once we get to the end of the deck, a slide deck here. But I would just recommend for this and any other issues that you want to influence, sort of what staff's going to do is going to take all this feedback and start to work on some draft language. If you care about this issue of like how type C is defined, what it would be used for, definitely take advantage of the time that there's going to be before that we're going to set to provide that feedback, so that we can then incorporate that in what we're going to propose. But I think a good discussion on that. I'm going to go to the next one. We can go back to this at the end if we feel like there's more to say. So this next issue is the pre-amendment conference. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with this, there is currently a pre-amendment conference that takes place at the beginning of the process. So the question was raised, and looking at what happens at this pre-amendment conference, is it worth scheduling? Is it worth having? Can we just skip it? And staff is recommending that we do just eliminate the pre-amendment conference. It's just another step in the process that, it's sort of like, kind of reminds me of like you have a meeting and you're like, that could have been an email. That's sort of the feeling on this pre-amendment conference. It could have been an email. So why are we sort of this, anytime you have a conference, it's expensive. It's time, it's can be travel. So one of the most important things, or perhaps the only important thing that takes place at the pre-amendment conference, is the determination of the analysis areas for the project. And staff's recommending that council just give it the authority to adjust the analysis areas, to match, whatever's being proposed based on information that oftentimes isn't available until later anyway. So I don't know if you have any more you want to add on that, Sarah, than what I just said, but
yeah, I'll just offer 30 seconds more. So the pre-amendment conference rule set, it's optional, so it doesn't happen for every project, which kind of lends itself to potential inconsistency. That's another reason we don't love it. And then if one of the values is to allow certificate holder in the department to consider reducing those analysis areas that were set in the original application to allow more targeted focus of resources, or even remove the obligation to evaluate resources within a distance of already built infrastructure that's not being impacted by the amendment. Oftentimes we aren't getting enough information at the time of a pre-amendment conference, or it's fairly difficult to make a call based on snapshot review of what we're provided. So, but then we still want the ability to do it just as part of the review of the preliminary, rather than before we have the preliminary amendment in hand.
Andy?
Yeah, just a clarifying question. Is it with council, or is it just with staff?
Staff.
Okay. I'm good either way. I mean, we like to have them because our facilities are so unique, but and we don't come in very often, but I don't have an issue with it going away as a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
The question I have is, if it's a really difficult decision, then turning it over to Oregon Department, just to the agency, without any kind of conference, doesn't make it any easier. And I think one of the issues with analysis area is you have an analysis area, you have a survey area, you have study area, you have all these areas that really need to be clearly defined. And I think that there's some upcoming problems with what is the micrositing area? What is the site boundary the micrositing area, or is something else a micrositing area? And the rules do talk about different things being reviewed within the site boundary. And I know at least in B2H, they're changing from site boundary to micrositing area without really clearly, they're not really clearly defined. And so I think it's creating a great deal of angst when these terms are being sort of interchanged with one another, and you have more than one statement or more than one topic that is really basically looking at the same thing. It's very confusing.
This is Sarah Esterson again. So just in response, Andy, to your comment, we still want certificate holders to coordinate with the Department of Energy on their plans for future amendments and to meet in person. So we're not suggesting that those types of pre-amendment conferences aren't valuable or that we don't want them, but the pre-amendment conference in Rule is designed, it's like, you have to request it, and we're talking about like confirming the rules that would apply in the analysis areas, and that level of review doesn't really typically happen in a pre-amendment conference. So I just want to be clear, we still advocate for the informal pre-amendment conference, but if a developer is interested in getting out of it what the rule has set up to do, that it's just not happening. So, and we don't have the right amount of information to do it if a developer wanted to do it that way. And then Irene.
Understood,
yeah,
and I completely agree, Sarah. Yeah, I
Okay.
think it's helpful for both parties to understand.
Absolutely.
The
Yeah.
project.
I mean,
yeah.
Right. I mean, it helps us workload plan, justify additional positions, everything. So we don't want that to go away. And then, yeah, I don't mean to interject too much here, Tom, but in response to your comments, Irene, I would say, that confusion, from our rules to definitions to specific applications of analysis area, micrositing area, survey area, study area, we can work on that. That's not necessarily a function or outcome of a pre-amendment conference.
Right. Although if they're deciding on the analysis area, I'm concerned because there are defined analysis areas right now, and there are defined study areas. And I believe what it says is that basically the analysis area has to be the larger of.
Exactly.
But yet, when staff are adjusting the analysis area, it tends to be to minimize the area. And so that's a concern without really significant justification, because oftentimes the impacts are going to occur beyond that area. I mean, it's been my observation that sometimes those analysis areas are too narrow to incorporate all of the indirect impacts. So it's like one of those places where I have concerns.
I wanted to raise my hand. So this is Paul Hicks with Tetra Tech, and just thinking about this from maybe the angle I'm involved in supporting developers and putting together applications for these various amendments. And the value I can see where, I know we've worked and used this particular 03603 previously is like, for example, if you have a facility where there's a change proposed, but it's already connecting to, let's say, 15 miles of existing operating transmission lines. If we used analysis areas that were defined by the original facility site boundary, we have to go back through, by the rules and then by demonstrating evidence for an analysis area that incorporates all of that, for example, transmission line that is in no way being, addressed by the project. And so we found it helpful to use, this pre-application conference to help define, and I think maybe scoping is the better word, of kind of scoping what is really, what's the main evidence that we want to look at in the amendment process, and what's important versus what's not really giving us added value for equipment that's existing. And that's a theme I wanted to tie into, like, kind of just as we look at the amendments overall, is that something along those lines, and I'm not saying it like a, you know, a required pre-application conference, but is there a way to have a process like that that helps us even in many cases, I could say more narrowly define like what types of evidence, you know, is staff looking for, you know, to meet the various division standards, because that's where I feel like a lot of the timeline moves. You know, I'm just thinking you could have a type A or B process and you could have a 30 to 60-day review. But if we, you know, the developer then has a number of RAIs that take 90 plus days to address, you know, some of that I think could be met on the front end by having a process that helps like more narrowly define what each amendment could be tailored to. And so I, you know, that's where I just wonder, you know, for Tom, Sarah, if that's something that's available if we take this process out, or can be done administratively and be part of the record. Because ultimately, like what we have to provide the evidence to is to meet those analysis areas. And if we don't have a step like this that helps us, you know, like in writing, you know, we're all in agreement, you know, we've reduced it for X and Y reasons. It could just make it a little bit more difficult in the back end of the process. So just a thought, I mean, is from the putting the application together standpoint.
So I'm gonna try to summarize a little bit here so that we have the right takeaway. And if I get this wrong, feel free to chime in. So the question I have is, what is the pre-amendment conference set up to do? And the follow-up is, what is it the best way of accomplishing that objective? And, you know, the main issue that I think Sarah raised is that certainly it makes sense to sort of meet and discuss and get in, define what the analysis areas are. But the issue is that at this point in the process, the information needed to do that is not always available. So that makes the pre-amendment conference sort of bad at being a consistent way of best addressing this issue of getting accurate, appropriate analysis areas. So having this sort of discussion is certainly important, but is it right here in the way that it's set up in rules? That's sort of the question. Obviously, having clear terms so that the public can understand, like, well, you know, there's 80 different terms that all kind of sort of mean the same thing. What do they mean? How do I know that I agree with staff, or in terms of, you know, where their designations are? Is this something that I want to raise to council, you know, in the public comment period? Those are things that we should definitely maybe look at. But to me, those are sort of separate issues from, is the pre-amendment conference a good idea? You know, is this something that should be happening later? Should it just be called an amendment conference? Having it at a time that makes more sense. But I don't know. That's sort of my takeaway from what's been said here. Anybody have any disagreement with that takeaway? Because we definitely have some things we should be looking at here.
I guess the one comment I would make is that if, you know, whenever adjustments are being made to the analysis area, there are a couple of things that shouldn't be narrowed down. For example, sage grouse and wildlife impacts. Even if you're making changes that are roughly near an existing facility with an amendment, those things need to be checked. You know, you need to do surveys, because you don't know what's happened in the last 5 years in terms of adaptations that have occurred with wildlife. I mean, there may be eagle nests that are on the border of the analysis area that weren't there before, and changing the development would impact, you know, would have an indirect impact on them, and may, I mean, you may destroy leks, you could do a lot of things. So I guess that's where it's more about when our analysis areas actually being adjusted, and why are they being adjusted for all standards when they are adjusted. So that I'll just kind of leave that hanging.
Okay, so I think that's a good summation. When and why. So making sure that it's clear to the public why they're being changed, and also to the developer, like, why staff would recommend it to be one, way versus the other. But also when that determination is being made. Does it fit with the current scheme? Staff's conclusion is that it doesn't sort of fit. So some change needs to be made. We're not saying we don't communicate with the developers. We're not saying that it's super clear right now, and maybe, and that changes shouldn't be made to the definitions to help people understand these things better. This is more of a question of timing. So I'm going to put a pin in that. We'll definitely look at that. If you have any additional thoughts on it, again, write down, right now on your little notepad. Think about this some more. Send Tom some thoughts on this, and before they start drafting stuff. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide here. So this is related to the preliminary request for amendment information requirements, and in Rule 360. Essentially, right now, what's happening is when people are filing amendments, they're saying, "Look, we're not really doing a whole lot here." And we meet all the standards for the same reason we met all the standards before. See previous application. And it just makes it kind of messy for staff, for members of the public, for anybody who's interested in this process to sort of identify what exactly, whether that's true. Like, how do you verify that? In order for the developer to make that assertion, correctly and properly, they're going to need to review, what was said before to make sure that it applies to the amendment. And as part of that review process, they're sort of going to have to dig through the weeds. So what staff is proposing is that at the end of that, you've already done all that work. Basically, show your work. Show your work to staff and to the public so that their verification process can be faster. You've already done the work. If you don't put it in there, now staff's going to have to go back and redo it. That's just going to make staff's review process take longer. Why waste the work that you did? So if you've made that determination, then showing your work will make the process quicker and easier to verify. So staff's going to remove the incorporation, or is proposing that we remove the incorporation by reference allowance, and that instead we're going to require explicit submission of relevant information. So, for example, if you're, making amendments to quadrant 1A, I'm just making this up, of the original project, then you might say, well, previously in quadrant 1A, we found the following, and, with respect to these various standards, and for this section that we're proposing, you can see that, whatever's is not going to be an issue, that the standard will be met with respect to, what impacts on wildlife or water or whatever. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, this is essentially, it's a little bit more work, but assuming that you did the proper analysis to begin with, it shouldn't be that much more work. And it's sort of like a little bit more work by the developer will hopefully be a lot of time savings by staff. And so, since staff's going to bill the developer anyway, presumably this would be an ultimate cost savings, because staff will have to bill less to the developer to conclude the developer's analysis was correct. So I'm kind of curious to see if the developers, if any developers on the call or any who represent developer interests, what your kind of takeaway on this proposal is, if you have one.
I've got comments, but I'll let, if somebody else wants to talk first.
Okay.
I can talk from a public perspective. It's very, very frustrating when the way the current process is, where there are references to the original site certificate, Amendment 1, Amendment 4, whatever, without having that information available in the current application. Because for one thing, if you go to the Odo website, a lot of times the full information isn't even on your website. So you don't have access to it. And I think it would be a vast improvement if the applications actually included all the information necessary to make a decision, whatever it's based on. That's it. I support the change.
Okay. I figured you would, Irene. We'll go ahead, Andy.
I'm going to ask Sarah a very pointed question. Sarah, I don't feel like we do this on ours. Am I right?
Yeah, I think when the amendment is an actual new big thing, there's a limited likelihood that you're referring to the past. We more see it with deadline extensions. So yeah, I would say that's not something we've seen in the Northwest Natural Amendments.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas, the way I don't feel like we do this at all. Only when
this isn't something that
right?
probably everyone is doing exactly the same. But yeah, go ahead.
We feel as though, especially staff, it's beneficial for them to have it laid out for them. We find it's, whether it's Odo or any regulator, it's best to spoon feed the information to them and then be available to, to answer questions, and especially when we're paying for Odo staff, to not have to have them go search things. But that's bizarre to me. from a and I guess I don't know if I really meet the definition of a developer as utility, but I don't.
Anybody who submits an amendment.
I don't have an issue with that going away completely. I would just like it to have the option, if there's specific things from I don't know, if there's I don't know the best way to say this, and maybe Patrick can help, is if there's legal language within site certificates that aren't going to change due to an amendment, but you could reference them in the amendment in that way, I think that's beneficial. Just, the stuff that moves along, and typically our amendments tend to have a reconciliation of the entire site certificate at the end of them. But being able to do that, I think, is beneficial. I don't know if that would be beneficial to staff, but that seems to be helpful.
Cole?
Go ahead. Hi, yeah, I'm Cole Souter from the Green Energy Institute. I just wanted to kind of add on to what Irene said, and saying that in the couple I've reviewed, it is a little difficult to sometimes find information that's being reviewed or that's being referenced. I think, like, just for like with Northwest Natural, with the Amendment 13, I think there were a lot of references to Amendment 11 that were difficult to hunt down, or discussions kind of in their past amendments that I think were kind of difficult to get the information from. And so, yeah, I just would appreciate having more of that just explicitly put in, either by like available at links or just whatever it is. Because again, like Irene said, when you're on the DOE website, a lot of the like underlying information has been stripped away from those previous amendments, especially when you get 13 of them or a bunch of them in a row. So I think it would be helpful, especially for like the public, people trying to engage and get involved for the first couple of times, to kind of begin to understand how to find past discussions that occurred and past lines of reasoning that are being relied on, and kind of just like adopted whole cloth without much kind of re-explanation. It'd be nice to have that stuff made a little more readily available, so we're not spending too much time in the kind of
there's nothing stopping you from
period.
There's nothing stopping you from hitting Control C, Control V. We're not saying you necessarily have to, like, to the extent you're saying all of what was said before applies. You could literally just attach it, put it in there in line. Like, see, here you go. Just to make it so that somebody doesn't have to go back and track down that other thing. David, you have thought.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get more examples so I know how much and what, because I work with NextEra. We've done, in one particular one, we've done 6 or 7 amendments, as we've partitioned off certain projects. And so is it linking conversation? Because we have to do a red line between, all the various, sorry. It's telling me to unraise my hand. Sorry. I just,
You're fine.
the whole, it goes beyond that. It would be explaining why we've kept or why we've, or recommending changes. Is that what we're talking here? Or is it instead of just considering all communication, or sorry, all back and forth is in previous versions? Is like just any more context there so I can understand? Because in principle, I don't mind. The thought seems correct, and I don't think we'd have a problem with that. It's just how do we do it and make it meaningful?
So this is Sarah Esterson at in the siting division. Again, I can try to give you some examples. And again, I think for kind of larger scale amendments that include new infrastructure and new site boundary area, this incorporation by reference isn't really relevant. It's a new evaluation. But for something smaller, and traditionally in something like an amendment requesting approval for a deadline extension. I'm just going to give you like a overblown example. So say that, let's just pick protected areas. So incorporation by reference example would say, we evaluated protected areas in the application, nothing's changed. Council found there was no issues. We comply with the standard, refer back. And what the analyst is going to say is, well, what did you evaluate to confirm there's no new protected areas? How many are there? And where's the map? And the map hasn't, so it's like, what we're saying is, if you're able to say the same set of resources of previously evaluated has not changed in any way today, and you can rely on that prior analysis, we want to know exactly what those resources are, what you looked at to confirm there's been no changes, and that it's all kind of packaged versus just conclusory statements and reference back. And so it's as simple as just bringing, to me, it's kind of like bringing the maps forward and the, number, type, location of resources, the specifics, and then if there's no impacts, there's no impacts. But if we have to go backwards to figure out what we're even talking about, that is what results in the time consumption.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, we wouldn't have any problem with that. It's about bringing the addendums or anything else in that are relevant to what we're asking for the amendment.
Right.
All right. So the next issue is related to partial facility retirement. So the current concern is how best to address decommissioning of just part of a facility. And I guess the conclusion is that we need more clarity in the rules in terms of to basically anticipate this and potentiality, because this is happening. So the proposal is to sort of clarify in the rules the inclusion of all facility components that might be retired at some point, so that when they are retired, the retirement plan already takes into account whatever it is that somebody wants to do. So does that make sense to everybody? Sarah, you look like you wanted to add.
Oh, no. Well, I'll just, and so just for a little bit more context. So this rule set is the termination rules, which we've only run on facilities that haven't totally been built. But so just, there might be a lot of issues with the termination rules, but we have been experiencing or observing that for some wind facilities, for example, due to operability issues or a fire for that turbine, that the turbine is taken down And we've questioned whether, you know, are we going to remember that that turbine was there when they come through in 20, 30 years to decommission the facility? Should the certificate holder be obligated to fully decommission, meaning taking the foundation out to 3 feet and restoring for ag use? So that's really the context. Like, what do we do? How should the rules apply to facility infrastructure that's taken down prior to full facility decommissioning? And then the fix that we have is to try to not say you've got to decommission while you're still in operation to a full decommissioning level, but to make sure that the rules are clear. You've got to have a decommissioning plan approved by the council at site certificate termination that covers everything that was originally built, even if it was taken down midway, because we assume it wasn't taken down to a decommissioning level.
So I have a question regarding that. If we go down this path and there's rules established about decommissioning, partially decommissioning of facilities, would we also then adjusting the bond money to account for that?
Right. Well, see, that's what we're saying we are not doing. We're going to keep it in, assuming you haven't fully decommissioned it. Maybe you just took it out, but you didn't take the foundation out. You didn't restore it to so that we would maintain the bond full.
Is there a pathway already that that, and we'll use a wind turbine as example, that it was fully decommissioned, and can a developer then come into the council and say, hey, we've decommissioned this completely, we've restored it, we've given it back to the property owner, and it's back in ag use. Here's what the costs were. How do we adjust the bond? Is there a pathway for that?
Well, and that's like exactly the question. It's so then if utilities, if certificate holders were interested in that path, then what we would be saying, I mean, I think we would have to amend the rules a bit to cover that circumstance, but then know that you have to go through this process of submitting an application for partial termination, get your decommissioning plan reviewed by council. You might have additional conditions that would apply to that. And then ultimately we could have justification to adjust the bond.
Yeah, I do see that as a potential issue with this, but something that probably needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah, Andrew, you literally took the words right out of my mouth. I would actually really want, if we're doing the whole solution, you should actually do the solution of partial retirement, where it's one of two. You actually do decommission those elements, and I could see this in. We have, as you probably well know, we have some wind farms reaching the 20-ish 5 years, and depending on what we do as far as, you know, the next stages of the project, it might not all be decommissioned at one time, but some of it might be. And we'd want the flexibility to either fully decommission it and change our bond. Like, let's say it's a 10 turbines or something. Like if it's a you know, a chunk, we would probably want to decommission everything, hand it back to the landowner so that we're not, paying that lease, so to speak, or whatever the reasons are. Anyway, so both. I would just suggest that it would be both, that you would have the provisions to say, up to us, we come to you and we say, yes, we're decommissioning these X, and we're down, and we show you a decommissioning, and then we adjust the bond. We show you that we've decommissioned it to appropriate levels, but we're not fully terminating the whole site certificate.
And that's really interesting. I don't think we realized that there would be interest in that avenue. But the one thing, and that it's like, so if you had a turbine, infrastructure that you've taken down, because like replacement of that could go through without an amendment, depending on what it is. But by fully decommissioning, going through that process, you lose your authority to operate. And, like if if you could have replaced that wind turbine in the place that it was in and were operating before fully decommissioning, mean it's done. You can't go back without going through the full
we
process.
realize that.
Yeah.
We realize it would be both. All I'm saying is that
You want the option.
could be, the option. And if we show you that we've decommissioned and we're no longer having those rights to put up something similar, right, or the same, then we want it done and then adjust our bond accordingly, and the megawatts of the facility accordingly.
And Sarah, that would also impact the regulated utilities, I'm guessing, from a rate perspective, because if we were to do something, say at the mist storage field, we would want to package a decommissioning of, say, a bunch of wells and pipelines associated with them and do it in a way that we got probably rate recovery where we can, because when those projects come online, depending on whether they're utility based or non-utility based, those rate recovery aspects are dealt with at the PUC level, and we'll probably want to do the same for those costs on rate recovery during partial decommissioning. So having a pathway for that would be beneficial for the regulated utilities as well.
Well, it's interesting because I think we were coming at it with a question of, let's go to our wind turbine had a fire, they took it down. Our lens was, should they be required to run, fully decommission it and go through the rules? And so, but it sounds like where we've moved now is, we're not answering the question of should it be required, but rather it should be an option for the developer to seek partial decommissioning site certificate termination.
And I also wonder if the easement, whether it's for a turbine or anything else, like what we've got, like, long-term leases for well pads, is there something within the lease agreement that of course you guys don't have access or vision, to, that would require us to give it back to the landowner, and having a pathway for us to do that. There may be a timeline that says, hey, we're done using this well pad. You have to turn it over to the property owner in 90 days. And is it possible for me to do that through a process at the FSEC?
I have a comment on it. From at least my perspective, and this hasn't been discussed with anyone else, of course, but the sooner these things get decommissioned and restored, the better, as far as I can see. And, things like noxious weeds and that sort of thing. If they're taking down a structure, someone is, the sooner they get it restored, the less the damages are going to be from things like noxious weeds. And so I would like to see that very available. I've had concerns for a long time about restoration when a facility is being developed, because sometimes these things take years. And so when rules say it'll be restored after the facility, goes into operation, that can be a really long time with some torn up ground. But so the same thing applies either way. The closer you get to having people encouraged to decommission and restore the site, I would say the better.
The other thing I would add, Sarah, is from a lease agreement or a easement agreement that happens with the private property owner that these infrastructures are on, is some wiggle room within the rules that allows, a lot of times if we've got temporary workspace that we've used and it's an ag land, a lot of times the ag owner doesn't want us to do anything other than to pull our equipment, our mats, and silt fence up, and then they're going to take over and deal with any sort of restoration. Just having that sort of, I guess, leeway within the rules or something like that from a decommissioning aspect, to understand that there's also private property owners that are involved in this, and that land's being turned back over to them, and their requests should be honored as well.
Like landowner authorization of a plan that might not have the level of detail for others.
Yeah, like a well pad, for instance, if it was a Weyerhaeuser or another timber company we get an affidavit from them that says, hey, we've asked Northwest Council to remove all the above ground appurtenances and any piping and leave the site as is, and we're going to take over for it for our operations and do as we see fit, that sort of thing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I see.
And just a quick question, maybe for you, David, how likely in general is it that if maybe like something that's been in operation for some period of time, more than the first 6 months, and it has had to be removed, either full or partial, how likely is it that it would be replaced?
Highly likely early on.
Right.
If it's early on, because we often have contractual obligations for a certain amount of power and capacity. It's nearer the end, or as you well know, we design them for 30-ish years, but often our contracts are 20 to 25 years. And so it's at that that last stage. Do you take and from my perspective, it would be a series of it wouldn't just be likelihood. If you had one, you would probably have a spare and you'd just put the other one up. Or if you're within a year of when you were doing your overall decommissioning or whatever, you would just leave it down and decommission it altogether. It would only be in a couple circumstances where maybe a section of the wind farm, for example, the towers aren't as in good a shape. There's other things going on. You'd want to decommission a portion of the site. I've been realizing that as both in the design initially and in the decommissioning, it's not a unilateral. Not all the equipment is in the same state. It's like a fleet of vehicles or anything, right? So that's the reason why we're just asking for the flexibility. And like Irene said, if we're taking a whole series down and it's not something that we need for the rest of the farm, it would probably be cost beneficial also to fully decommission that, give it back to the landowners, and decrease our bond levels, because we have it no longer in play. Does that help with at least framing?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, some interesting points that certainly I didn't think about. So appreciate you raising them. I think it's especially, I'm intrigued by the idea of allowing the landowner to basically set what restoration would look like. I think that's, they own the land, so if they're okay with restoring something to a certain point, I think it makes sense. I haven't thought about it a whole bunch, but it does. At first glance, it's logical to me. I always like the idea of empowering landowners.
Yeah, Thomas,
I'm a little nervous about that because, I'm thinking about things like roads. That's the one thing when you're not taking them out because you're not creating extra damages. But if you're actually causing impacts, do landowners really have the authority, or should they be given the authority, for instance, to remove a wetland, or damage a wetland when the developer's taking things down? I think that if I agree with allowing it, I think that the landowner should have input. I think I'd give you a caution about what kinds of impacts actually a landowner can approve.
Well, I don't think the AppSec and rules can give authority to landowner that they wouldn't. Like, we can't say a landowner is authorized to violate the law or do things that aren't allowed in statute. So I'm just saying, within the bounds of what is already basically what they would already be allowed to do to their own land, legally, then they should be allowed to sort of let a developer say, you don't need to. I don't need to hear like Bambi, going through the meadow when you're done. So, because I'm going to do something else with the land that's going to, where getting it to that state isn't needed, it'd be a waste because I'm gonna rototill it right back up again or whatever.
Right. I can see that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Tom, we
Okay.
run into that on a regular basis, whether it's closing out a 1200C or a JPA for a wetland impact on ag or forest lands. Those landowners have different rules they can operate under than us, and oftentimes they don't want us to do anything once we're done other than just to clear our stuff off and hand it back to them, and then it's up to them to decide. But I think, Irene, at that point, what we're trying to do is just establish, hey, we no longer have control over this property. It's been handed back off to the landowner. Here's the date in which that happened. And then after that, it's not our responsibility. Not to say that,
Right.
but so that it's up to the landowner to decide. And ultimately, it's they're going to be taking it and putting it back into use how they see fit. So I don't want us to be in the middle of preventing that from happening, if at all possible.
Okay. Thank
All
you.
right. Also, we've been going for about an hour. I'm good to keep going. We have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 8 more issues. We've done like 5 or 6. So we're not halfway yet. Are people feel like they want like a 5-minute break or a bathroom break, or come back refreshed, or do we want to go a little bit more before we take a break? Any thoughts on the break situation? No? If I hear nothing, we're going to keep going. We're going to go over a little bit more, and then maybe let's take a break at like 10:30. We'll say. Okay, so this next one, I'm going to tap Sarah again, but this relates to explain this one a little bit. But this relates to the notice requirements for site certificate termination. Right now, in the rules, it just says there is a comment on the termination, but there's no time frame given in the rules, and doesn't even clear what is being requested in terms of what people need to comment on. So staff is recommending that we clarify the what and the when. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or if you felt like
No, I thought you did perfect. And
Okay.
just to confirm that the what is, we would be asking, or we're intending to clarify that comments are requested on the retirement plan and the cost estimate. Those are the 2 elements of a request for, or an application for termination. And what we want to try to make clear, it's not an opportunity to just dump comments unrelated to that, because we wouldn't be able to do anything with them.
I like the idea of the when, adding the when frames.
Yeah, it's pretty vague as currently written. Okay, if I'm going to go to the next one, I think that one's pretty straightforward. Okay, so this one relates to post-construction updates without amendment. So currently, there's sort of some concerns amongst staff on how best to manage site certificates for facilities that are ultimately constructed below authorized limit. So they get authorized 15 kilowatts, let's say, and they only build 10. What do you do now? So there were some thoughts that we should do some different things in the rules to sort of track this. For example, if you were obligated to, do some, weed control or wherever the development occurs, or fire management, but you only build 10. Well, then how do we know, like, how do the compliance officers know, like, are you being compliant here, or the development that was previously agreed to didn't happen, so you didn't need to do it? And basically, we concluded that no, the rules are fine as is. And that really this is an FSEC issue that we can resolve internally. And it's really about us doing a better job of tracking, and maybe having a better internal process for tracking what actually gets constructed, so that we have a better sense of what that means in terms of compliance and whatnot. So we're unless people feel strongly about this one. This is something that could be improved. but we don't feel like the rules need to be sort of modified to address the concern.
Thomas, I have a
Yeah,
question on this.
sure.
You know, and this situation scenario probably wouldn't happen with a gas facility, but one that would happen, and I don't know if this would pertain to this, but if we had an entire site certificate that we threw a bunch of stuff into an amendment, and not all of those elements got built due to market changes or something through the duration of that project, is that something similar here, or is that a different aspect that we're dealing with here? Meaning that the infrastructure that I built was already is still going to meet the threshold, but not all of what I proposed in my amendment got built due to various reasons. And how do I reconcile that with staff and the council so that when Sarah's team shows up for compliance and they're like, hey, this compressor was supposed to be here, it's not here, and you know, what do we do? And is that the scenario we're also talking about here?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
It happens a lot on the power side. Just market changes. Customers only need a certain portion, right, after you've permitted. Often we bifurcate first so that you don't have the excess. The excess becomes its own site certificate, so to speak, also through the amendment process or bifurcation. But I can see that this, especially if it's small amounts, you might not make that change. And it's making sure that you're only focused on the parts that you've actually put your improvements on, right? So, okay.
Yeah, and the other aspect that I would add, and Sarah, you and I have talked about this, is on the gas side, we also have the carbon standard. So I've paid money to the Climate Trust for 4 turbines, and I only put in 2, and I've overpaid. What happened? You know, what can I do with that money? Can I roll it over to my other turbines that I've got, or do I get it back? You know, what are the mechanisms for reconciliation there? And I don't know if there is a path for that to happen.
Yeah. Well, and I think our position on those conditions is that the prepayment obligation is based on final design at that time, not max permitted. So you should have an out there.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, and I just wanted to offer, for whatever it's worth, you know, we've been tossing around an idea of like, it's like a form and fee, where after the completion deadline has passed, there would be some simple process that would allow the developer to request that that site certificate be updated to reflect what the facility actually is. But that is, even while simple, and then to like take out any conditions if we were to have any that were specific to the infrastructure that's not been built, so that we can all know exactly what the facility is and the applicable conditions forever. But we don't really traditionally have component specific conditions, and there are mandatory and generally other conditions that allow us to know what the facility is. We just need to do a better job about knowing that and keeping our records clean. And I think, you know, we can get through it. It is tough though, when a site certificate kind of speaks in the present as if the facility is this, but it's actually not.
So then
it wasn't built that way.
I just have a question regarding the rules. Then, Sarah, in that instance, say we didn't build all of our facility and we took it out and went through that process, but then down the line in the future, we decided, no, we need this now. Do we need to go back through an amendment process to make that happen then?
Right. Well, you wouldn't in this scenario that we're not proposing a form and fee. It would only be after your deadline has passed. So you would still need an amendment in your scenario.
Okay. Thank you.
It seems that FSAC is already getting most of that information, or should be, when you adjust the bond amount to the
And you're exactly right.
built.
That's exactly right. It should be based on the actual facility, and it's in Excel form, so we would have an easy understanding of that, you know, line item and facility component detail.
Yeah, this is just a sort of like a process issue, and it sort of, I feel like, has a process solution. So making sure that everybody's on the same page is important, but I don't think we need to, you know, in terms of like what gets built. But the process already sort of takes into account, and it's just about making sure that the left hand is talking to the right hand in terms of at the siting team, where the siting analysts and the compliance staff are all sort of on the same page about what the facility, and we track that internally accurately so that there aren't questions about like, wait, hey, this was supposed to be 15 kilowatts. I'm only seeing 10. You know, how come there's no, you know, fire mitigation here or whatever? That shouldn't be a mystery for the compliance officer when they're rolling up to the site to do the examination. But that's not something that we need to change in the rules, or at least that's not the thinking there. We need to change that. People can disagree, maybe rightly so. Okay, so I'm going to move along. So extension deadlines and requirements. So this is honestly, for me personally, this is a weird one because I'm curious to see what you all think. Right now, there's a sort of like a need requirement for requesting extensions. We do these relatively, with some regularity, and it's sort of like, it's like a lot of work, but like, where's the value? Like, what is the point of having needing to establish sort of a need? There's no requirement in statute. Council doesn't really have a need standard that is. So we basically have the process stuff and we have the standard stuff. There is no standard related to need for extensions. So why are we requiring that from the developers? And it's just sort of a waste of time and resources because they all go through. So it takes up council time as well. So staff's recommending we eliminate any reference to need and that we delete the provision in 385.5, which honestly, now that I'm just going to pull it up here.
Because that's related to the amendments that would be on the bubble of the prior amendment rule set.
Yeah. So basically, so the idea is that if you want an an extension, you would just apply. You would just submit a thing, and then you would just get it. Take 2 seconds.
No.
Well,
just for
they
clarification.
would need to show the need. Yeah.
Right. There's just a simple statement in the amendment submittal requirements that an amendment for a deadline extension has to include an explanation of the need for the deadline extension. And then they give most of the time the developers give the same types of reasons. We need time for financing. We need more time for pre-construction compliance. Maybe they say we need time to secure an interconnection agreement. All of that makes sense. It applies to everyone. In some instances where the project is controversial, that brief information requirement that is providing the explanation of need has been used as a substantive or, alleged to be a substantive threshold where people have said they haven't provided evidence. These aren't good reasons. You need to deny this extension request and site certificate is dead. And even our council has been a little confused about, well, why is this requirement to provide an explanation of the need for an extension here if I don't get to evaluate the merits of those reasons? And so, as Tom's saying, because we don't have a need standard for renewables, there's like a disconnect. And so we're just proposing to remove this reference in 0385 sub 1 to a requirement that they include an explanation of need. We're not saying there's no need for deadline extension amendments or that they are easy and there's nothing there ever, just to clarify.
And
Yes.
Sarah,
Thank you,
wouldn't
Sarah.
that also tie back to the lack of the need standard for the non-generating facilities as well?
Right, right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
So
for
we would,
any
yeah, we would agree with that to get rid of the need requirement for deadline extensions.
Mhm.
Yeah, you still have to go through it. You just wouldn't have to establish the need.
Yeah. And I'm sure most certificate holders aren't even really aware of this little information requirement because it's always the same and no real information is provided, and it just bubbles up during the DPO process in an uncomfortable way.
I have a weird question. I mean, why is there really a need for a deadline? What's the driving force behind that?
That was my
That was
That
where
was
you
my
were
personal-
going.
That's where I
Yeah.
was going, Andy. Basically, I feel like I feel like there should be more teeth or no teeth. I'm just confused with where sort of things are at the moment, because I do get the idea that there needs to be some sort of certainty in terms of standard compliance. So
Yeah.
obviously, if you establish that you meet all of our standards, I don't think anybody's going to argue that that's going to be true forever. Certainly, things could change over time, and as more time passes, the likelihood that things have changed goes up. So I think a deadline sort of is a reflection of that reality. But I don't know, Sarah, did you have some thoughts you wanted to?
Yeah, so I mean, the deadline extension, now this is the purpose, like the primary scope of what we're doing for a deadline extension, where that's the only change that's being proposed for the amendment, is to evaluate changes in fact and law, and predominantly it ends up being changes in law, because things don't tend to change that frequently in terms of facts on the ground, like the resources previously evaluated, the environmental conditions aren't so dynamic that in 3 years from prior approval, something's changed from like a habitat category 5 to 2, for example. But we might say that's something we're looking at. And so, but I think that it's really more substantively about changes in law, like our wildfire standard, right? Those that were approved before 2021 didn't evaluate that standard. So we're working with a deadline extension right now that rules is in place and will be evaluated. And we should have another rule coming out on that will apply. And so I think those are important. The question we're asking, because we traditionally for an application recommend an initial commencement deadline of 3 years and then 3 years from your start. And, we're like, well, based on really the infrequency of legal policy changes that would impact can we be thinking more about if that initial commencement deadline can be farther out from approval? Because we want there to be a valid need to do a deadline extension. And so it's really kind of trying to estimate the frequency of rule law changes that
Okay.
apply to renewables.
This was a big deal not that many years ago, the extensions of deadlines. And the reason that it was a big deal is because you had a whole bunch of developers who were, and you remember this, Sarah, who were getting site certificates. They were sitting on them for years. And so people really, really didn't have any kind of finality about, is this thing really going to be built? When is it going to be built? Mm-hmm. And what kinds of changes are going to occur between when the site certificate is requested and issued and when something actually happens at this site. So, that really sort of drove, in at least from my understanding, being involved with the process at the time, it was about requiring developers to actually do something with those sites instead of laying claim.
Right. And our rules now, right, hopefully everybody knows this, but they different from what was in place prior to 2017, do have a limit. You can only request for a deadline extension 2 times, no more than 3 years extension each. So there is a sunset. And if we stick with what we routinely do in terms of, or what council does with the initial commencement deadline of starting in 3 years, finishing 3 from there, then you could have, is that 9 years? It's like a 9 to 10 years is that hold before it officially has to go away or start over.
And I'm going to apologize about my misunderstanding. We didn't realize we were talking about commencement, but I understand that. The one thing that we don't operate that way. We just, typically we're chomping at the bit to
Right.
get work started, right?
Mhm.
It's the other end is when we're done. And I don't know, Thomas, if is there a discussion about completion deadline extensions? But if
I
there
think the
is,
same applies.
yeah, I mean, I would prefer to have that ability, but I would also like to have the ability as a site certificate holder to indicate in my amendment that, like an amendment 13, it's going to take us probably 5 years to build
Mhm.
all the aspects of that, and being able to set that deadline out in front further than 3 years, knowing that
Yeah.
it's going to take that long to construct something. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then ask for extensions beyond that. If needed. And is there a limitation to completion extensions?
Yeah, the same limitation applies to both
Okay,
front or
so
back end.
3. Okay, all right. It's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, and I would put this to the group as well, as part of this, thinking about altering the sequencing. This is in 385 sub 3 in terms of the timing of the extensions. Does it make sense given the complexity of these projects and the frequency at which we see amendment extension requests for construction? Does it make sense to have a longer initial period so that we don't have to deal with processing as many? Because if we're processing them all and we're finding that we're frequently seeing issues or things that then it's serving its purpose, then we don't change it. But if we find that most of the time nothing's changed, then it seems like it maybe is a sort of a waste of time, and that there is some value in having deadlines and in requiring extensions. But does it make sense to have a longer initial period? I mean, you're not throwing up a hot dog stand here, so, and especially given like the interconnect situation, like there's so much uncertainty. I mean, I think demand is going to continue to skyrocket going forward, but like, it's not happening linearly. It's not like you can predict it.
Nope.
So, yeah, I do think giving a larger initial window is something that we should consider.
Yeah,
And I know the developer is going to support that, but I'm going to be curious to see what public feedback is on that.
Well, from a developer perspective, I would agree, Thomas, but one of the things that I think needs to be taken into consideration here is we can't always do all of our additional permitting that's required in parallel to the site certificate. A lot of times we can't get other permits that are required that may be long duration permits, such as air permits, that sort of thing, until we get our final order. So there's that aspect of it. So, but I think the 3 years from a commencement perspective on the gas side is at least okay. I don't know what the other developers are, but I would like to see the deadline for completion maybe pushed out to 5 if it's already set at 3. I think that gives us a better window so that we're not coming back to staff and council asking for those deadlines and spending money unnecessarily. It's at least for the utility, on the utility side, that's going to be those costs are going to be rolled into rates at some point, and we're all paying for it. So there's that aspect to think about, but that's the gas perspective.
And sorry, go ahead.
David, did you have a thought from the maybe renewable side?
Well, first of all, yeah, the need, I totally agree there with what is proposed. The initial start date, because I can understand what Irene's saying. We don't want to sit on something that has cost us, you know, in a lot of ways, millions of dollars to get to a certain point. We don't want to do that. But interconnection in particular right now in the Northwest and getting transmission services, because it's both, it's interconnection and transmission services. At certain times we've been told, you know, it's going to be 3 to 5 years, and then, you know, they do a couple more studies, and the next thing you know, it's 10. And so I'm not saying so an initial, a little bit longer, an initial, but also as we do the amendments, you know, making sure that we are updating. Any amendment needs to update to the law that is in place at the time of the amendment. I think something like that is a little bit of a compromise and can actually work.
Mhm. Well, I'd say we agree. I think and Andy, just to clarify, the initial 3 and 3 is not in rule. That's kind of just something is standard based on weighing what developer is saying in an application compared to what council's typically done, but it's not in rule. So that and because of some questions we're having on really what is the need when we're evaluating a deadline extension, when really there is no change in factor law. It's still a big effort for us. So we are at a staff level trying to open up that what has been traditionally a 3 and 3, and advocating for developers to, sometimes they say we're going to build tomorrow. Sometimes the application says they were going to build it a year before, and so we kind of lose track on what exactly the developer is seeking for that timeline. And so we're going to try to work more closely to make sure those deadlines are reasonable. We can't give too much more. I think, 5 is probably something we're willing to consider as an initial commencement coming out of an application review.
Sarah, if I could add, Paul with Tetra Tech, just some additional thoughts on that. I'm just thinking, for like from a change on the ground perspective versus the changes in law, like the change on the ground, often your wetland delineation concurrence is like a 5-year good for process. And a lot of the guidance that we'll receive from like ODFW or SHPO is kind of like surveys. It's, there's no firm firm regulatory time frame, but it's often like 5 years is about, if it exceeds that, you should consider getting back out and re-reviewing. So I just think that aligns maybe more with some added flexibility, because from our perspective too, and working with developers, there's been very few projects where we haven't had to do, been asked to support a construction amendment. Fairly shortly after having the site certificate.
Right.
And another thought too, I was just thinking this kind of dovetails back with, and maybe it's not the pre-application, but just working with Odo and I don't know if it's something that can be reflected in a rule change, but getting at some of these construction amendments, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into them on the applicant side as well. And if there's ways to kind of like work in advance to streamline what are like kind of the key concerns or key changes in law that we want to focus on, as opposed to kind of having to reopen everything. If there's a way to do that on the front end, I just bring that up for consideration as well.
Yeah. And I would like to say that if you're extending the time frame for start of construction, and then people are coming in for an amendment, the amendment evaluation should increase in significance in terms of things like requiring new surveys, wildlife surveys, and things like that, because things are going to change a lot. I mean, some things aren't, but it's bigger than just changes in the law. It also is about, is the information still current that the original decision was made on?
I know. I would really like to have some type of checklist by standard that the developer submits with these types of amendments. I mean, that they affirm they have reviewed current sources before making the statement that's nothing has changed. And I mean that we would trust them if they say they have. Maybe we would ask them to identify which sources, and then any new laws, and then that's the focus. And I mean, if some sites don't trigger like a need for wildlife surveys, given where they're at, but anyway, I mean, it's just we're working with a deadline extension right now that it's like they didn't even do a lit review to confirm that nothing's changed. And I'm like, this is so basic, but we've spent over 3 months and we're kind of just reevaluating what we already evaluated, and everybody's missed the mark on focusing on the changes in fact and law. So it must not be clear what it is that everybody's supposed to be doing in these amendments. So it seems like a checklist would help. We could easily do that without rulemaking, of course, aside from not having the resources to actually do that. But
all right, so the next few here should be real simple, and I saved the juiciest one for last. So let's maybe go through these simple ones real quick and then take a 5-minute break so that we're all fresher for the final one here. So this one here, real simple. There's rules and statute requiring hard copy requirements for the initial application, but there's more flexibility for the amendment rules because there are no. I mean, the statutory requirements for amendments are I don't want to say non-existent, but they're far fewer, and basically it's sort of up to the council to decide a whole lot more things with respect to the amendments. So we each have more flexibility. So I'd love to do this for the regular applications as well, but we can't until the legislature makes a change. But there's nothing in there about the amendment process. So we're saying get rid of the hard copy requirements. It's 2024. People can print it out. We'll make it available on the ODA website. As we already do. We'll retain that. But anyway, I don't know if anybody feels strongly about murdering trees, but it's just a huge waste of time. Okay.
I murder a lot of trees, and
I'm not saying you can't, but in terms of requiring it, these applications aren't small.
Right.
Okay.
The issue, just 1 second. There still are people in Eastern Oregon that don't use computers. Believe it or not.
They can go to a FedEx. They can go and they can print it out. Like you the option's still there. It's in terms of like requiring everyone to print it out all the time, regardless of whether anybody's ever going to ask to look at it. And a lot of times people don't ask to look at it. It's printed out and then it's put into a recycle bin eventually, decades later. So why are we making everybody do it? You still have the option to print it out. It's just this is about what we're requiring everyone to do. Okay. But if you have strong feelings about this, add this to your comments that you submit to me, and we'll definitely maybe there's things I haven't thought about.
Well, it's nice to have a place where people can see the hard copy without having to. I mean, I really do burn a lot of trees, and I try to be to not do that, but I also cannot analyze these things without having a hard copy in front of me.
Anybody can print out. However, you can print out 5 copies if you want.
Right.
This is about what we're requiring the developers to do for the applicants.
This is just for the developers, because people can already go to your central office, right, and see the hard copy.
Yes.
I'm asking.
Yes. The answer is yes.
Okay. I just want them to have a place.
And that won't change.
Yeah. That's my issue. So thank you.
Sarah, do we pay for that as an applicant?
Yes.
Perfect. Happy with that.
Okay. So this one maybe is also hopefully not controversial. The rules are sort of vague in terms of what we are looking for from reviewing agencies as part of the amendment process. So staff's thinking that we could clarify exactly what we're hoping to get from reviewing agencies in terms of their participation in the preliminary request for amendment phase. Just spell it out a little bit more. And that would be something that we could then share with the reviewing agencies to say, hey, we're looking for X, Y, and Z, or whatever. Okay. This next one is also pretty straightforward. There are in-person hearing requirements for regular applications, but we're thinking there should be more flexibility for the amendment rules. It would still have in-person hearings where possible and where it makes sense, given the nature and size of the projects. But staff's thinking we could add something in the rules that would allow waiver by council if there's a public health risk, another pandemic, heaven forbid, or some sort of safety risk. Maybe it's really icy. I don't know. Who knows? But just providing some flexibility for the in-person requirement.
I concur. I had one of both of those where, like seriously, where it was like super icy and we couldn't convene, and also obviously during pandemic time. So yes, I concur
it doesn't make
that
sense.
Some flexibility to have that by waiver and establish it, make sure both public and participants know. But yeah, I would agree.
What's the process for having that happen? I mean, the other thing, from a dark side of it, if there was some sort of threat against the council meeting, being able to hold it and still continue with that. But what would be the process? Would it be the staff would request it, or the council request it, or could the applicant request it, or all of the above?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I don't see why you would restrict the ability for anybody to ask the council to do it, who would be a required participant, certainly if the applicant felt there was a need. I mean, I think like if there was an ice storm, hopefully it would just be self-evident that it would be a good idea to not require an in-person hearing. But if you felt like there was risk to personal health and safety because of bomb threats or something, and the council wasn't aware of that, hey, council, we've received some threats. We're uncomfortable holding this in person. Do you think it'd be appropriate for this particular meeting to hold it remotely? I think, I don't know why we would restrict who would be allowed to request that.
Okay.
I would think that if you're not going to have an in-person, though, I mean, different people are comfortable with different processes, and it might be worth just including in your initial opportunity to comment on the site certificate whether or not people think that they really would like to have a in-person hearing. I mean, just to get.
I think the preference is always to have an in-person hearing. This would be an exception process, not a matter of course. It wouldn't just be it's inconvenient for me to show up to this one or whatever. Can we just do it remotely?
Yeah, I agree with that. Not to just make it a standard.
Yeah. But some delay is delay. So yeah, I mean, where it makes sense, So I think obviously we'll draft something and people can maybe comment on that once they see the language. Okay, one last one before a break. So this is would be the issue is whether we should modify the current exemption process for determining that proposed change does not require an amendment. There was some thinking that amongst staff that maybe this could be more clear, that we can make a change to that. But, we looked at it and we reviewed this and thought about it and decided that no, the current exemption process is good enough. And honestly, this is just one of those things where it's like over time we've gotten better at this. So yeah, there was maybe some issues at some point. But as we've continued to sort of apply these rules more, it's becoming less of an issue. But I'm curious if does anybody else have any strong feelings about this particular issue? Do you feel like the rules are clear with respect to what changes are exempt from requiring amendments and the process for making that determination?
I'm going to thank Sarah for finding an exemption for me after looking at the rules, but I just think it would be, and I guess there's probably nothing to add to the rules that make this more clear, but just, I guess we would be, if we were going to go do actions on a site certificate that we felt were exempt, I would probably reach out to Sarah and confirm that anyway, but, yeah, I guess I don't know if my comment adds any value, but anyway.
So most of the exemptions are for related to a underground natural gas storage facility. And I just wanted to clarify for those of you that are tracking, I think that the predominant rule reference for this issue is 0353, which is a specific list of exemptions that are exempt from requiring an amendment. We don't have to do an evaluation. It's set in stone. So if that list needs to include other things, that's what we were trying to figure out. And we simply don't know. We don't have the ability to come up with additional scenarios that wouldn't trigger the 3 coulds. So it sticks to being exemptions for Northwest Natural predominantly.
And Sarah, to be clear, we don't have to file an ADR to get
Not for
confirmation on
those.
the-
Nope.
Okay,
I mean, not at all.
perfect.
Okay, this is perfect timing. It's 10:55. Let's take a 5-minute break and get a drink of water, go to the bathroom. I'll see you guys at 11 o'clock and we will finish out with a banger.
With the banger. Okay, thanks, Tom.
Is there MASH?
You'll have to wait and see. All right, I gave you guys an extra few minutes because you took an extra few minutes. Okay, people have their cameras off, which is totally fine, but I don't know if you're back unless you're Irene or Sarah. So, but I'm going to continue here. It is 11:03. Okay, so the last item on the list here was contested case for amendments. So I'm sure maybe some eyebrows went up if you guys took advantage of the material I sent around last week, but there is a concern that the contested case process for amendments is not serving its purpose. So just as a review, the standard to trigger a contested case and an amendment is in rule. And this rule has been tweaked a little bit, but the basic threshold precedes everybody who works on the siting division. Nobody knows anybody who drafted this language, but it reads as follows: to determine that an issue justifies a contested case proceeding, the council must find that the request raises a significant issue of fact or law that is reasonably likely to affect the council's determination whether the facility with the changes proposed by the amendment meets the applicable laws and council standards included in Chapter 345, Divisions 22, 23, and 24, which, as you know, probably is where the standards are. So if you think about this language, and I'd be curious to know who drafted it, what they were thinking, but just think about what this says. This says that you can't have a contested case in an amendment unless the council finds that an issue that was raised would change the council's opinion with respect to whether that issue shows that a standard was not met. But who is the people who reviewed that issue that was raised during the DPO phase of the amendment to make that initial determination? It was the council. So this is sort of a circle here where the council has to find that you raised an issue that would have changed their mind with respect to something, but it's sort of like a tautology here that if it would have changed their mind, then it would have changed their mind. So the fact that it didn't change their mind means that this test, I mean, unless they were asleep at the council meeting where they made this determination initially, and people misread it or something, or they realized they made an error, it certainly reads in a way that it's like, because you can't present new evidence, you can only, this is only stuff that you raised before. So it's just sort of like if what you raised before would have changed their mind, then it would have changed their mind. So it may come as a shock to all of you. I say sarcastically for those watching later and who don't know me. I love sarcasm. This standard is never met. We don't have contested cases for amendments. And Irene, who's applied, for many contested cases for amendments, can certainly speak to this personally. That she's no longer shocked when they don't go through. But honestly, she shouldn't be, because if the thing she's concerned about would have changed the council's mind, then it would have changed the council's mind. I don't know if you guys are following me, but the question is, what is the purpose of a contested case, and do we need it? I mean, is it helping this process come to a more accurate and a better result for the people who live here in the state of Oregon, and for the applicants themselves? And I'm curious to hear what people have to say on this, but internally, it's sort of like, we're committed to getting the best result, and we are committed to the public participation in this process, but there just seems like there's too much focus by the public on the contested case, and it's sort of like a shiny object. Like, we heard of an individual just at this last council meeting, which was a week ago, say in his comment that he was formally requesting that he was like reserving the right his or he, okay, I'm going to butcher it, but essentially that he was requesting a contested case. But that's completely misunderstanding the purpose of the public comment period of a project. If you want a project to change, your best chance for that to occur in a meaningful way is during the public comment period. It's during the DPO phase of an application for an amendment. So you shouldn't. I mean, he was already this individual. I don't want to speak for him, but at least from my perspective, it looked like he was. This was like the DPO was just like a bump on his journey to the contested case, which is where he wanted to go. But the contested case is sort of like in my view, it's sort of like it's a bump on the way to the Supreme Court, and it's sort of an alignment of the facts. I mean, it has some sort of functions that it's supposed to serve, but it seems like it's distracting folks from the purpose of the public participation, which is to surface information to the council and to developers that they may not have been aware of, that would hopefully get us to maybe improve conditions or change the nature of the project to ensure that it complies with the standards that projects are required to meet before council grants them a certificate. I think, and I'm going to open this up for public discussion, but I just want to get this sort of staff framing here, that by removing this thing that never happens because this standard is never met, so it's not like we're losing a contested case. What we're losing is sort of this belief that a contested case is good. I mean, presumably this could be met. It's not like it can't happen. It's just that, I mean, if you read it fairly, you'll see why it's likely, you'll understand why it hasn't been happening and why that's not going to change anytime soon. So we could change this standard here, but there's a reason why it's higher than it is for an application. Presumably, a site has already sort of been vetted, and obviously an amendment could be a complete new addition in an adjacent spot. But it's not like you still have to meet those standards. Just because it's an amendment, you don't get to skip steps in terms of, showing that what you're proposing meets all the required standards. It's just about how we get there. And I think that by refocusing public attention on the DPO phase as being the spot. You have a concern with the project. This is the place to fix it when things are not sort of in stone, as it were. I think will be beneficial. I will help people understand that the contested case is not. It's not where they want to go. It's not where they want to be. If you want to change the project, it's during the DPO phase. And if you really feel strongly about something, then obviously there's the Supreme Court. And that was always true. Even if you went to a contested case and counsel disagree with you, or the hearing officer disagree with you, the Supreme Court was always sort of the end game. But we're not having contested cases for amendments. So the illusion of a contested case or the belief that something that will likely occur, I guess, let me say it that way, when it clearly won't, I think is harming the process. So helping the public understand where they need to focus their energy, which is the DPO, or whatever we would call that, the public comment period, I think will be beneficial to the public, to the developer, and it will also make the process more efficient. But not in the sense that we're skipping steps, but in the sense that we are removing sort of bureaucracy that's not really serving any function, which is the application that people are submitting to council to have a contested case for an amendment. Okay, that's sort of my framing on this. I'm going to turn it over to Irene first. I can see you visibly. Oh, you're muted though. Your mic is muted. So you got to unmute. You're still muted.
Am I unmuted now?
You're unmuted now.
Okay, great. Obviously, I have done a great deal of research on this issue of contested cases and amendments. And basically what I've found is that when the legislature initially did this, the assumption was that there would be a process for developing a case file. And so the process would either be through people asking for an amendment for a contested case through the agency, and the agency providing that, which developed the arguments to go to the Supreme Court, which is why on the rules and the statutes, they say if there's a contested case, there's a process that you go through. It's 403 with FSAC rules, and it's 484 with APA rules. But that if you didn't have a contested case before the agency, then that file would be developed by the circuit court. And in fact, there are places where they talk about the circuit court being the avenue for developing the file. So if the agency didn't provide a contested case, then people would appeal to or ask for reconsideration through the circuit court to get this case file developed. And that was because the Supreme Court rules say that their review is limited to review of the file, the contested case file. So if FSAC is denying people access to a contested case and then requiring them to go directly to the Oregon Supreme Court, they have no developed file for the Supreme Court to make a decision on. So that's why, I mean, I have had there have been multiple court decisions that say that if there isn't a contested case, then the Oregon Supreme Court doesn't have the authority. They don't have jurisdiction over making the decision. And those cases go clear back to in the early 60s, saying, and I mean, I've listed a bunch of them here, but the language is really clear. It's saying things like Supreme Court's review authority is limited to review of the council's approval or rejection of an application for site certificate. And it says that anyway, it keeps referring to the Supreme Court as reviewing approval or rejection of the site certificate. And there's also like a court decision that says the Oregon Supreme Court lacks jurisdiction over modifications to the site certificate. So with all of those rules that are saying you have to give people, basically they're saying you have to give people an opportunity to have a file to send to the Supreme Court. And not only because the Supreme Court review is limited, but also because there are limits on even the amount of information that you can provide when you appeal to the Supreme Court. It's like the number of words that can be in your request for Supreme Court review. So that's why this whole thing about if the agency is going to decide not to allow any kind of contested cases, it seems to me that is a decision that the legislature should be making, because you are circumventing, if you're requiring people to go directly to the Supreme Court and you're circumventing their opportunity to have a file for review at the state court or at the Oregon Supreme Court, that shouldn't be an agency decision. And recently, even the U.S. Supreme Court has said, well, they've done away with the Chevron standard, which says agencies can basically have the authority over final decisions, and said that the courts have authority over these final decisions. So as far as interpretation. So all in all, there are lots of legal consequences of making it impossible for an applicant to have anything for the court to review and saying that they have to go to the Supreme Court. So whatever you do here, I think if you're not, when these rules were initially started, there was an intent that people would have the opportunity to have contested cases on amendments. And in fact, when the Energy Facility Siting Council years ago said, we want the agency to look at the amendment rules as far as getting a contested case, because they felt, and they stated that they felt there were situations where on an amendment, the access to a contested case with the agency should be a right, just like it is with applications. Now, between when that initial request was made and when the rules were actually promulgated, the intent of the agency changed significantly to the point where you're right, they're not allowing any contested cases on amendments. But this is a huge issue, and to me, it's a legislative issue, because it's going to keep getting in court if it doesn't go before the legislature. I mean, I personally have brought 5 different cases about jurisdiction for a case where the agency denied access to a contested case. 2 times the Union County Circuit Court ruled in my favor. 3 times the Oregon Supreme Court ruled in my favor. And I can give you a dozen different situations where the Oregon Supreme Court has said, you know, if you don't let people have a contested case, then we don't have jurisdiction. They've said it over and over and over again. So just keep that in mind. You know, does the agency not want to take the role of developing the file? And if they don't, then the legislature really needs to decide how that should happen. That's what I have to say.
So what I would say to that, and I'd love to hear Patrick's take on this, Patrick Rowe, our DOJ representative affiliate buddy, is on the call as well, is that the file is the application. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I feel like the contested case process for the citing is perhaps not as useful. Everything that was needed to show whether or not something was met, a standard was met, is in the application itself. The part of the problem is that contested cases are used throughout, you know, across the agencies, and in some cases they're extremely meaningful because certain rights are taken away by an agency. For example, let's say you're, you know, a doctor and you lose, you know, your license, for example, your ability to practice, and you want to contest that finding by an agency that resulted in the revocation of your license. You know, the contested case is the avenue for contesting that the loss of your ability to practice. So in this case, with the citing, with the way citing works, you know, you have a public comment period before the council makes its decision. So it's not like things are happening, you didn't know about it, and then now you need a contested case to sort of like, hey, you know, they didn't, you know, this action that was taken without my knowledge. I take umbrage with, you know, how it was done. This is everything that's happening in terms of the citing is laid out for the public to see in the DPO. I mean, that's essentially the sort of record formation period that we feel, you know, that the citing team feels like that should be where people should be putting their energy on. That's where you should be developing the record. That's where you should be submitting your information the best that you possibly can, because that's the point at which your information has the highest value to the process. So just barely crossing the threshold so that you can then get to a contested case is a sort of like, I think, the mentality that we're seeing, but like that's the complete opposite of what should be happening. You should be putting 100% of your energy in to putting the best comment you can when it has the most value. And so I don't know if I buy you any time, Patrick,
That's
but
not what
if
the rules say. What the rules say is for public comments, you say who you are, you say what your issue is, and at least one piece of documentation that supports why you have that decision. And then when the council makes a decision, you have no opportunity to object. And yet all you have on the record is a public comment that doesn't evaluate or assess or argue your argument. It only identifies the argument and one thing that would support it. And then you ask for a contested case, and you're told, based on the rules, that you can't even argue additional documentation when you request a contested case. And so you have no file. I mean, all you have is the developer's information. You have no opportunity for the public to have analyzed, argued, and provided conflicting documentation that shows that what the developer is proposing is not legitimate. That's why there's a need to develop a file for review. The public has no.
Irene,
Mhm.
I get you're passionate about this, but you're making my point for me. You're saying the public only has to do a little bit of work, and we need to contest a case to do what? I mean, if you want to improve the project, if you want to make it comply with the standards, I mean, what is it? What is it that you're trying to do? Like,
Okay.
what is it that you're trying to accomplish by making your comment?
Okay.
Like, what is the goal?
Okay, if you're not going to provide a contested case, then the instructions to the public needs to be that you fully develop your arguments, including all of your documentation, and what the basis would be for you to appeal the decision of the council. That's not what your rules say. They say an issue, who you are, and one thing that says why you feel the way you do.
I completely agree with you. I think the way it's structured now makes people feel like the DPO phase is sort of a throwaway, and you're looking down the road. But like you're approaching this from the assumption that you're going to disagree with council, which if that's true, then you're going to disagree with the council's conclusion of the contested case as well. I guess there's so much deference, and I know I know you mentioned the Chevron doctrine, but this isn't quite like that, right? Because the Chevron doctrine is sort of like an umbrella approach to judicial review of agency findings. But in this particular case, that's when it's ambiguous, right? And in this particular case, the council has been created by statute to make determinations about whether standards have been met. So in statute, the council is the primary vehicle for making standards-based decisions. And obviously, they could make mistakes. And, we have sort of, you can appeal to the Supreme Court. But that just, they're looking for clear error, essentially. They're not there to quibble. Because the council was the process for making those determinations. It is a decision-making body that is designed to make decisions on behalf of the public in terms of whether or not these standards have been met. So unless, just like, I guess I feel like so much energy has been put forth by the public in participation in this process as to do a contested case, to appeal these decisions, when most of the good of that energy, to the extent you had any power, would have been at the DPO phase. So what is it that we're trying to do? And I think you've raised some good points. Can we clarify to the public, hey, if you have concerns about a project, like we don't want you to just barely cross the threshold to qualify for some process down the road. We want you to front load it. Give us everything you've got so that we can actually do the best that we can to improve that. Patrick, take me off this train. Derail me.
Yeah, I just have a couple of thoughts.
Sure.
2019.
You're kind of hard to hear, though.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can move closer to your mic.
That any better now?
Yes.
Okay. In 2019, the FSEC, the amendment rules were challenged at the Supreme Court back then by Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And one of the aspects of the rules that Friends was taking issue with was the authority of the department to decide whether or not an amendment would go proceed as a type A or a type B amendment. And Friends' argument was that the department shouldn't have that discretion because, as you guys know, a type A has a contested case, a type B does not. And Friends argued that only the council should make the decision as to whether or not an amendment should be subject to a contested case. And in considering that argument, the court considered it and rejected it. And the court said there is no statutory requirement that there be a contested case on an amendment at all. And so because there is no requirement that there be a contested case on an amendment at all, Friends, you can't complain when the department makes it available on a limited basis, i.e. Just under a type A. So what we're suggesting here is that we do remove it entirely. The Supreme Court, in reaching that decision that I just described, did not express any concern about the development of a record in order for them to adequately be able to review it. But I do recognize that given the way the rules are currently set up, talking about, look, you just need to raise your issue with sufficient specificity, we would need to review that, revise it, and make sure that the public understands that you're establishing your record at the DPO phase. So that's something we haven't internally looked at yet. Right now we are just initially presenting this idea. So the comments that you're making, Irene, about the need to have an opportunity to more thoroughly develop your arguments, if we remove the ability to request a contested case, that makes sense to me. And we would internally then need to address, how would we go about doing that in the rules to make sure that the public understands that the time to develop your argument would then be in your comments on the DPO.
The other piece of that would be currently people send in their comments, but when it comes time for the council to review them, only the department is allowed to provide information to the council. So there is no opportunity for the public to say, hey, you did not present my arguments the way I proposed them. You did not state the issue the way I stated it. And so the council is making their decision based on a lack of thorough and complete information. So it's sort of a two-part issue, I think.
Yeah, and we can, with the idea of then having kind of a back and forth before council, that to me, in my initial reaction to that is, it sounds like it's kind of a mini contested case before council. So we would want to, as Tom has said, the emphasis really is to provide, and council has said this recently, they really like the written comments. It gives them a chance to sit down and truly absorb them. I don't know where we'll go with this as far as how we would, what we would do, what details we would include in the rules to establish what is expected now in comments on a DPO for an amendment. That is something that we'll have to go back and further discuss internally.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, like, we looked at, like, there's just as sort of some context. There's a lot of pressure to optimize the citing process. If you look at all the legislation that's passed, I'm talking about the legislature in the last few years, none of it was to provide more public comment period, to make it harder to get an to get a, all of it was stripping power from FSEC to make it easier for developers to sort of opt out or opt in by the most recent change was having, or rather doubling the threshold needed to trigger a mandatory FSEC review. So, in the context of 100% of, legislative pressure being, what are you doing to make this process more straightforward? We feel like it's important that we take a good hard look at every aspect of this process to say, what is the value? I just personally, I hate doing things just for the sake of doing things. What is the value in individual steps in the process? So when I hear you talk about like creating a record, I do think, okay, that's a good point. I mean, being able, to the extent you're, you want to present your best case to the Supreme Court, and you don't really have a great opportunity under our current system to, if we didn't have a contested case, to do that, then I do think it's appropriate to say, well, where can we sort of get the value that you're looking for from a contested case? Is there another way that we can provide that? So I do think that means that we could tweak the way we frame things in terms of what we're asking for during the public comment period. But to me, that's just right in line with our current objective of placing all the value on the DPO. What we've, recent changes we've made have been to increase the public comment period for all projects to ensure that there's adequate time to develop the record, as it were, so that you have adequate time to review projects and provide the best comments that you can. So those are the sorts of things where we're not just suggesting we, eliminate the possibility of a contested case in a vacuum. It's really about moving what you see as the purpose of that contested case earlier in the process. So to the extent there's a record to create, to the extent there's more information available to prove a point, you should not be holding on to that until after the once the contested case process would have begun. Like, if you had extra information, you're like, well, I provided enough to get to this point, but now here's all the real good stuff. Like, why didn't you provide that earlier? It's when the developer could have looked at it and said, oh yeah, okay, you made a little point before, we didn't quite get it, but now you added all this extra stuff. Now we do agree with you that we could have, tweaked the project or whatever. Like, you should not be holding anything back. And I've sat in council meetings and I've heard people say, literally, I'm giving you enough to reserve my spot, but I have all the good stuff. I'm going to give it to you. I mean, not in so many words, but I mean, my eyeballs went like this. I was like, what did I just hear? Somebody said, they were like, oh, I'm just giving you enough to get to the contested case, and I've got a whole bunch of other stuff that I want to give you later. It's like, no. We want that stuff now. We don't want that stuff later. Later is that's the pound of cure. We want the ounce of prevention. Give us everything now so we can do something about it before things move along in the process. So obviously I feel strongly about this. I'm very passionate when it comes to things that I care about. And I just feel like waste of time is one of the things that bothers me the most. So, but you've raised some good points about what we're missing if we lose this. So, are there ways we can optimize the process, but help the public understand?
Okay, there's about to be a test or two of whether or not this can work that way, because there are going to be appeals on the RFA2 based on what I hope were very complete comments and documentation at the point of public comment and in the requests for contested cases. So we'll see how that goes.
We will indeed. But I guess, I don't know, Irene, do you see the point I'm making about, like,
I see what you're saying, and from my perspective, if the agency provides that opportunity and the information to people so that they understand that they have to make their arguments at the DPO level, so they have something to take forward. I think that's, that has a potential of working. I still am not quite sure how you're going to get around the statute that talks about non-contested cases don't go to the Oregon Supreme Court when they've made so many decisions that say the only time they do is if you have already had a contested case, they go to the Supreme Court. Or
So
here, so
we'll definitely look at, because we don't want to propose any changes that aren't supported in law or statute or would contradict sort of court holdings on this issue. I'd love for you to send me whatever you've got and identify. It would be even more helpful for you to identify like exactly what language you're referring to. But I'm curious, does anybody else have any thoughts? You've heard from myself a lot. You've heard from Patrick. And you've heard from Irene here. Is there any utility or developer opinion on what you are looking? How do you view public participation being optimized? How can we make it better so that it actually serves a useful function? David, you have a thought?
I came up. Yeah. We welcome it. We also welcome it at that DPO. One of the things is, just as Irene said, that as soon as it's through the DPO hearing, the draft proposed order, we as a proponent also do not have, we no longer can address directly the council. It has to always, it goes through staff. And so I just, on that part, that part is the same. I just wanted to point that out, because it's not as if we also have this other ability. If we do that and we adjust timelines or not requirements, things that could be brought forward as part of the DPO, we should make sure that there's an opportunity to both from staff, council, and probably the proponent on how to address concerns or something along there, because it's always one of the things that as a proponent I want to do is be able to address or put forward our responses or ideas on what has been brought forward by the public. And I welcome any of those kinds of things as long as it's within the timeline, because we think the timeline is still reasonable, that we can all be working together on responses. And so that would be my only sort of additional piece to what's going on. On amendments in particular, just straight from a developer perspective, I think you've said it well, but from a developer's perspective, waiting on, in a sense, tenterhooks about the potential of a contested case when it's already has been an approved project, and even if we're going through other avenues, is, I think, a benefit to the overall process if we can, as Irene points out and others have, get that dialogue and the actual responses to public comment and proponent worked into that process.
So let me kind of dovetail off that, because I think you're making me think of an issue here. Like, let me give you a scenario and see if Irene and David, you both agree with this. Imagine if a developer is proposing an amendment, they want to build out in an area adjacent to an existing project, and somebody comes forth and they say during the DPO phase, during the public comment period, I live near there and I saw an endangered species near there. And that's a highly salient fact that could have an impact on the project or the proposed amendment. But you're like, which endangered species? Where exactly did you see it? Like sort of an RAI on the public comment. Like, this could be important, but I need more information to really know the scope of you know, because we have surveys done, nobody mentions anything. Do you have pictures? Like, is there ways we can verify this? Is because the point is the public provides comments, and those comments allow the developer to potentially modify the project, or council to require the developer to modify the project to address those concerns in a way that will allow the project to continue to meet the standards given the new information. But maybe the new information is like not great, and so there's something there, but like you can't just do one round, as it were. Then we sort of end up in as Patrick said, a sort of maybe a mini contested case. But I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, because that's where we should be putting our focus anyway, right? So if we sort of drag that process out a little bit, I think that's better than sort of and that would certainly help develop the record more, as Irene said. And that's where we want to resolve the concern. So if resolving the concern can't be done in just, here's my comment, good luck. Yeah, maybe there's things we can do to tweak that process to it's going to be, we're going to have to put our thinking caps on, but because obviously we don't want a full-blown contested case during the DPO, but just saying submit a comment and hopefully that's good enough for us to do something with it also isn't necessarily optimal either. I don't know. Did I characterize what you were thinking, David?
Well, to a degree, it would be to those more specific responses, and you do provide a response, but it's back to staff, right? And there isn't. You can do things, and I've done it directly with people who have brought forward the issues, and then you can do things outside of the actual process, and sometimes you come up with solutions there. I've done that too, but if it's just simply to be able for both to respond directly on the public record, it might only be that. If there is more information that comes forward, that would help us. If there's, if it's just a response, but it would be a response directly on the record, so that it would help everybody in the future. Because again, if it is something that could, but we don't have it specifically. Anyway, all I'm saying is just a little bit, maybe one more go around to respond, and that's all I'm saying is, if that meant that the contested case, it would either just go to the Supreme Court, or you wouldn't have to do that. It would be part of that process. Anyway, there we go.
I think I see what you're saying, David. Go ahead, Patrick.
Actually, it's a question for David, actually. So the way it works now is the public makes comments on the DPO. We have the hearing on the draft proposed order, the in-person hearing. And within the last couple of years, typically what council does is then they ask the developer, the applicant, do you want time after the public hearing to respond to comments that have been received? And oftentimes the applicant or certificate holder will say yes, and council will give them an additional week or so to respond to the comments, still on the record. So those responses are on the record. It sounds like what you're saying is you would like potentially an additional opportunity to further respond. Is that what you're suggesting?
I've done that just recently, that same process that you've outlined, but we didn't hear back from the parties specifically that were asking the questions, I guess, if you know what I mean. And it's not until the PO it's not the hearing part, but when the council's doing their back and forth about what will be the actual proposed order, then that's when the member of the public or county or whoever can actually just can ask for a contested case or not. If I'm understanding the process, this is the way I've seen it play out. And all I'm saying is just even if it's just on the record and it's still part of the same, it's like getting a response back from either that whoever put in the initial comment from our response, and it's still, in a sense, the record is not closed per se, but it's closed within a certain period of time after we've had a little bit of a go back and forth. I don't want it to draw out into this big one, but it would just allow for some final thoughts on the issue. That's all I'm asking. I'm not asking for a big additional thing. That I just thought that might be a way of making it so that there's a bit of back and forth before if contested cases off or not a decision point at the PO hearing or the PO.
It would certainly help, because in a typical quasi-legal or legal hearing, what happens is someone makes a motion, the person responds, and the person making the motion does get to make some comment about what the recipient of the motion had to say. And I think that there is a great deal of problem, because the public will make some comments, the developer will respond, and Odo automatically accepts the recommendations of the developer, and the public has no opportunity during the entire process to clarify if there's misunderstanding or to disagree or make any kind of response. It's like if you're getting legitimate due process, there should be something more to it than just turning in your comments and then having the developer and the agency interpret and provide the language or whatever for the council to just say yes. That's how it is right now.
I mean, we're sort of butting up against the end of our allotted time here, but the council does it. If you submit a written comment, they read it. Staff, summarizes it the best they can, but the council has an obligation to review all of the materials that are submitted. So you can't just say, well, I didn't like how staff characterized that, and I've been denied justice. The council reviews the comments that are submitted. Just recently with the rulemaking that I had, council spoke about the comments that they reviewed. They didn't just refer to my summation of those comments. So we have to provide opportunity for public. Speaking of public comment, I don't think we have any non-members of the RAC included, but to the extent that I'm just sort of my brain isn't working, I just wanted to double check that there were no members of the public that are not on the RAC already and who wanted to make a comment. Just before we ran out of time, I just wanted to make sure. Okay, nobody's raising their hand or saying anything. Okay, so well, we're not going to resolve this in the next 9 minutes. But I do think, Irene, you did raise some really good points, and David as well. I really appreciated your feedback on this. This is not a straightforward proposal. Notice we just have a sentence here. I didn't want to come. I could have put like 10 slides on what we were thinking, but I wanted to hear what you had to say, and I think there was a good approach, because my opinion on exactly how this should go has changed over the course of our conversation, and hopefully you can take advantage of the next little bit. I'm actually just gonna so for next steps, I'm gonna post this presentation as soon as I can. I'll let you know when that happens. We'll make it available. I'm hoping, and you can let me know if you think that's not going to work for you, that you can provide any additional concerns, thoughts, or feedback on any of the issues that were raised or discussed today and if you've already said your piece, so be it, that's fine. But if you had any additional thoughts, I'm going to give you till October 14th to submit those to staff, to myself. You can just reply to the email chain that I've been using to communicate with you all. And then we'll take that feedback and use it to develop draft rule language to be reviewed at our next RAC meeting, which I'm thinking will be scheduled for sometime in November. But date TBD. Yes, TBD. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about the timing, schedule, what we're looking for? Yeah, it's a lot to think about for staff in terms of this is a very good discussion. I thought maybe we'd be done in 30 minutes. You guys bumped us right up against the 3-hour mark, so that's great. It means that this RAC had a lot of value and gave us a lot to think about. It makes me a lot more confident that when we submit something to the public, it will have been more thoroughly vetted, and we'll get more meaningful feedback as a result. So reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns about the next RAC meeting or how you can contribute, or any questions about the process, or any if you have concerns about any individual issue. You don't have to just submit an email and say, here are my thoughts. You could also, we could set up a time to talk. I'm happy to do that as well. If you wanted to have a discussion, if that's just how your brain works better, happy to do that. Did anybody have any thoughts, or we have a couple more minutes left? I'm mentally drained. I've been sick for the last week, so I don't have a whole lot left in me for today. But okay, well, hearing nothing, I'm going to stop the recording here. Okay, recording's been stopped. And I'm just going to say